successfully. All right. You all see the slides?
Yep, perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, fantastic. And thanks so much to the organizers for pulling this together, and to Lisa for the book in particular. Is it? We're still seeing the slides? Sorry.
Disappeared.
Okay, it disappeared. All right. One second. Sorry about the technical problems here. Share this window. All right, still seeing now?
Yep.
Great. All right, fantastic. Well, I want to thank Lisa for the book. I think it's really excellent and it deserves quite a lot of praise. I just wanted to highlight some things that I think are especially excellent about the book before getting into some discussion points. So one of the things that is striking about the book and is also consistent with Lisa's work generally is that it connects this really unusually broad range of literatures in an unusually broad range of domains. So when you read the book through all the way, it's really impressive to see just how much Lisa can engage with the domains of the literatures about democracy, about markets, about work, about inequality, about economic growth, about time, just this kind of incredible ability to just take a lot in and synthesize it in this illuminating way. And to then send it back out into this world in a way that's really accessible and engaging. And it makes sense to me that, Lisa, as you were describing, that the book is being read both as a more public book and as a more academic book, because the arguments are rich on the academic side, but it really is written in this very engaging and accessible way, making complex ideas simple and illuminating examples and metaphors. It's really fantastic. And the result then is that I think it makes a really compelling case that the many people today, especially in the US, who are concerned about the fragility of democracy, have reason to also be concerned with questions of economic justice. And so it's really valuable to be pulling the set of people who are primarily concerned about democracy into more like the terrain that's more familiar to those of us who are primarily concerned about economic justice, and like seeing the connections, the deep connections between them. So thank you for that. All right. Did it stop again, or are we still? Okay. Okay, so I wanted to talk about 2 points today for discussion. And I should be clear that, as will become clear, like as we're discussing, these aren't really objections so much as invitations to talk about the book further. So the first question is how strong the state interventions ought to be to ensure time for democracy. And then the second question, I'll elaborate on the first, is the second question is what other kinds of conditions to ensure that people engage in civic activities might also have been overlooked in addition to time and might be complementary to providing time for democracy. So to the first, about how strong the state interventions ought to be. So should we think about providing time for people to participate in civic activities in a way that is in some form mandatory? And then once people are provided with time, should we think about inducing them to engage in civic activities that are in some way mandatory? And so those two together raise these questions about how strong the state interventions ought to be to ensure that people have time for democracy. So to the mandatory time question first. So in the chapter on time, Lisa recommends in particular moving to a 4-day work week. And she also considers arguments for providing a kind of civic day. So I'll focus on those two. But I think the general point, I don't think that Lisa's wedded in particular to the 4-day work week, but to some kind of interventions that would ensure that people have more time to participate in civic activities. But if we just focus on the 4-day work week and the civic day as our two central cases, we can think about the implementation questions. So if we focus on the 4-day week, the weakest form of an intervention would be to provide people with the right to not work more than 4 days per week for the same pay, but with the permission to work more. So this would be a right that individuals would be able to exercise at their given employer But because it's weak, it does indicate that some employees at a particular firm might be working more than 4 days per week. And of course, it also indicates that some firms might end up with almost everyone working more than 4 days per week. And it also would allow people to work more than one job if they wanted to. So the weakest form, the right not to work more than 4 days per week, is compatible with a great many people continuing to work more than 4 days per week. Then the strongest form of an intervention would be that to prohibit people from working more than 4 days per week. And in the very strongest form, to prohibit people from working more than 4 days per week with any employer. So you would be, in some form, prohibited from taking on secondary employment within another employer. In between, you might have some kind of form where you're prohibited from working more than 4 days with a single employer, but you're permitted to take on a second job. So the reason why you might take that form is that in order for it to have teeth, it must mean that like every employee within a firm is only working Monday to Thursday. And once you allow people within the same firm to be working more than 4 days per week, it kind of undercuts the ability of some to choose to work less because the people who are working longer are getting the promotions and so forth. So in order to have teeth within the firm, it has to be a prohibition. But that doesn't say anything about whether or not someone who really is keen on working could take a second job where the intra-firm dynamics then would not be at play. So there's this kind of range from the weak form to the strongest form with this some kind of middle option. And then similarly, Lisa suggests that when we have additional time, we should have 1 day per week that is conventionally marked for civic activities. And so the idea here is that we should think about the problems of coordination so that people have time together to engage in civic work. And so the weak form, again, would be that we just rely on social cues and some kind of nudges to coordinate a day for civic activities. So we have public messaging of some kind that, let's say our 4-day work week is implemented such that we all have Thursday off, so we try to have messages about how Thursday is the civic day and that kind of thing. Children are educated in that way. When the schools or other institutions are setting up civic activities, they are nudged to pick the designated day. So that's the weaker form, but then the stronger form would be to prohibit people from working on the civic day. So we would then bar people from working on Thursday unless they're providing essential services like basic infrastructure, medical care, that kind of thing. And we might also prohibit businesses from opening on the civic day. So the idea here would be, if it's truly a civic day, we wouldn't want people to be doing discretionary shopping, discretionary leisure pursuits, going to the movies, that kind of thing. The idea would be like we want people to be engaged in some kind of civic activity, and so we would close the other businesses that are not directly connected. So those would be the stronger forms of intervention. So the question that I want to raise is whether or not we should be favoring the stronger forms. So on time in particular. But then there also are these questions about whether or not we should be favoring stronger forms of obligations on service. So in the book, Lisa's clear that she's arguing only for enabling conditions for civic engagement. And she is not arguing for making civic engagement mandatory. So I think it's not clear in the book whether or not Lisa's arguing for the stronger or weaker forms of ensuring that people have access to time, either the enabling or the mandatory forms. So on the providing time part, that part is open in the book on the implementation side. On whether or not we should make engaging in civic activities themselves mandatory or just encouraged. Here, Lisa's clear that she's not arguing for the mandatory approach. She's just arguing for enabling conditions. So she's arguing for a weak form of intervention, which is to provide people with opportunities and incentives to engage in civic activities. One of those opportunities is by providing people with time. We might also foster certain kinds of projects, structure projects in certain kinds of ways to encourage people to engage in civic activities. But the stronger form would be to have a universal or a conditional requirement to engage in civic activities. A universal requirement to engage in civic activities might take the form of mandatory national service. So there are lots of arguments for some kind of mandatory national service. I think Deborah Satz, in a relatively recent piece from 2022, makes an especially nice case for having mandatory national service. And Lisa, in fact, cites Satz's proposal for national service, but says, considering the mandatoriness of national service is beyond the scope of the argument here. So really, I'm just kind of inviting to a chance to think more about that footnote that says that's beyond the scope, to think about like, well, should we think more about mandatoriness? Another way that something might be required is in a more conditional way. So we might have mandatory pro bono work, for instance, for professionals above some income threshold. Let's see. So I just want to invite Lisa to say more about with respect to time, should we be favoring the weak or the strong forms of intervention? And with respect to service, why endorse only the weak form of intervention? So of course, we're going to have respect for individual freedoms, so individual freedoms of occupation, of association, more generally to pursue one's own idea of the good life. And those would favor the weaker forms of intervention, such that someone could still choose to work longer hours, and someone could still choose not to engage in civic activities of the desired sort. And we might also have some kinds of feasibility concerns about the stronger forms of intervention. But I think Lisa's arguments that are presented in the book for why it's important to have time for democracy are compelling. So those arguments about how care, very broadly understood to include not just caring for children and the elderly and other dependents in our kind of conventional understanding, but caring for the community more broadly. She cites the examples of caring for the community's social life, caring for the historical preservation of a community, caring for the local biodiversity. I think it's really an advantage of Lisa's approach that she thinks about care in this broad way. And I think it's also really compelling that she argues that this kind of care, very broadly understood, plays a really vital social role, and that it's going to be underprovided in a market society. So that's the first argument for why we need to have time for these kinds of broadly understood caring activities. That's very compelling. The argument about how in these civic activities, we learn how to engage democratically with others. We have opportunities to engage with each other as equals, also a compelling argument. And then this distinctive argument, the third one, about how providing kind of a robust civil society fostered through this fostering of time for democracy ensures that a society has the flexibility and the kind of nimbleness to respond to urgent problems. And the example of being able to respond in Germany to needs for refugees is a great example. And you can imagine lots of other examples where having this kind of latent capacity in society to respond collectively to urgent needs is something that's quite vital for a society to be able to weather robustly these kinds of crises that emerge at different times. So if we think that it's important that a society has stability, has resilience, then I think Lisa makes a compelling case for why we would want to ensure that people have time to engage in these democratic civic activities. So if we think that all of those arguments are really compelling, it does raise the question of why we wouldn't make the interventions take the stronger form. And so more generally, are there conditions under which it's justified to favor the stronger approaches? On making the time for democracy part, the time part, more mandatory. We might be especially sensitive to conditions under which the economic incentives to work longer hours are very strong. And in those cases, it might be based on sectors or occupations or different societies. You might think, okay, well, in those conditions, we have to favor a stronger intervention and more of a prohibitive approach, because if we only provide people with the opportunity to work less, people are just going to continue to work really long hours. And then with respect to service, we might also think like, okay, well, for particular people, we might want to favor the kind of conditional requirements. So if you meet certain conditions, having some time set aside for civic activities now is required. Or even if you're kind of wary about mandatory civic activities like across society, those concerns might be attenuated if we're only talking about national service for 1 year around the age of 20, because it's so limited in time and because the benefits are so great in providing this space where people can engage as equals, come to know each other across classes, do valuable social work, and all of the kinds of arguments that Lisa makes for why we need time for democracy. So that's the kind of general question. And then I just wanted to zoom in on a particular group of people when we're thinking about whether or not we should make time or service mandatory, is whether or not there might be requirements for the elite in particular. So if we think about highly paid, highly skilled professionals, they often work very long hours. There's been this bifurcation in the labor market where it's often the elite, these highly paid, highly skilled professionals are disproportionately likely to work long hours. This is especially pronounced in the US, but not only in the US. And so if we think about those people in particular, they might have they have these particular economic incentives to work long hours, to engage in what's called greedy work. So employers want employees who are especially dedicated, who are available all hours to engage in client-facing work. And employees then have this pronounced wage premium if they engage in the greedy work. So both employers and employees are incentivized to have these long hours. So in Claudia Golden's really excellent book on career and family, which she describes as greedy work. And so if those economic incentives are particularly strong, does that make a case then for the interventions on time being stronger? We might also think about the parenting norms that apply in particular to the advantaged classes. So parenting norms I think across developed societies, but this is especially clear in the US, are to invest all of your available time in child enrichment. So these intensive parenting norms are driven, at least in part, by perceptions of class precarity and social competition. So the background inequality is, I think, contributing to these parenting norms. And so if you have intensive parenting norms, when people aren't working, they are then investing their time in their children. And so if that's happening, do we need the interventions on service to take stronger forms rather than just providing people with opportunities for civic engagement? And then the last consideration to raise for the elites is that highly skilled professionals have high levels of human and social capital. So they've received a lot of training for their profession. So they have this kind of expertise that is of social benefit. They also tend to have, pretty advantaged social networks. And do they have then a particular obligation to be using their talent that's been developed in their social networks for a civic benefit? So that's a kind of particular case to consider when asking whether or not we should be making time for democracy mandatory on either the time side or the service side. Okay, then the second point, much more briefly, is whether or not there are other conditions that have been overlooked that might be necessary to foster time for democracy. So if we're doing this valuable thing, which Lisa's doing, and showing how engaging in civic activities, having civic engagement requires that people have time to actually engage in those activities, should we then think about what other kinds of interlocking conditions are also required for people to actually be able to spend their time in the desired civic ways. So some of the conditions are going to be quite familiar, and they've received their own independent attention. So things like civic education, ensuring that there are adequate public spaces for people to gather, things like public transportation so that people can actually get places, those kinds of things. So some of those arguments have, they're made on independent grounds. They're also made from the perspective of civic engagement. But some of them might be less familiar, that are also relatively overlooked. So some of these are with respect to time itself, and I think that Lisa would be quite open to these. So one that she's already indicated support for is this a concern with coordinated time by setting aside a civic day for a coordinated day for civic engagement, but then also things like having predictable schedules. So not being required to work overtime with no advance notice so that you can make plans and actually participate in things, not having what are in the UK called 0 hours contracts, where you're basically always on call and you don't know when you're going to work unless your employer needs you at a particular moment. Also standard hours, so protections against having to work what can be called antisocial hours, so evenings, overnights, weekends, because those might be the times when civic engagement is particularly likely to happen because most people are available at those times. And also it's kind of interesting that we might also think that there are reasons from the perspective of civic engagement to foster part-time work in particular. So on the part-time rather than full-time, that kind of case is obvious. Is the point that Lisa has been making, which is that we need to have the time available to engage in civic engagement. So it can't be full-time or more than full-time. You need something closer to part-time. But also it might mean that it's valuable to help people not go to no work. I was thinking about this because in Putnam's research on the kind of temporal conditions for civic engagement, I was rereading this recently, and he notes that there's this interesting gender component that I won't get into, but for women in particular, they were in this kind of mid-century boom of civic engagement. It was women who were often driving that civic engagement. And in particular, it was women who were working part-time. So they had the highest civic engagement compared to the women who were working full-time and the women who weren't working in paid employment at all. So there might be something about part-time work where you have the time available that you wouldn't have if you were doing full-time work. But at the same time, there might be some cost to being in a no paid work situation where it's, we can kind of speculate about what those dynamics are, but I think that's an interesting question. And then also I was wondering whether or not we might think about conditions with respect to bandwidth and attention. So Lisa in the book is great at drawing on some of the research about bandwidth, about this point that if you have a scarcity of time, it means that you're just kind of, there are a lot of stressors, there's little time to be reflective, and it can impact our ability to make choices that are well considered. And so there's this kind of time concern for ensuring that people have bandwidth. But I wondered if we might also think about protections against addictive technologies. This is somewhat more speculative here. But you consider the Netflix objection, but my understanding is that current like distracting technologies like the TikToks and the rest are much more addictive even than Netflix. Even Netflix with its like autoplay feature does not compare to the scrolling features of some of the technologies that we now have. And if we are worried about that kind of Netflix objection to any degree, doesn't it apply much more strongly to these kinds of technologies if they can be demonstrated to be addictive, and then to institute protections against the addictive qualities? Also speculatively, I wondered about protections against noise. So these seem like they're closely connected to time in the attention and bandwidth domain. So especially for low-income neighborhoods, my understanding is that they're more liable to the intrusions of noise. So the homes are closer together, the walls are less well insulated, the traffic is greater, and so forth. And so when you are exposed to more noise, my understanding of the research is that, it does diminish, it has some negative effects on health and well-being and diminishes, it might diminish bandwidth. And if that's the case, do we also then have reasons to be more protective, especially in the neighborhoods that are more affected by noise, with instituting kind of time, more practically enforcing time-based restrictions on noise? I say that one is like kind of interesting because, of course, civic engagement itself is often a very noisy endeavor. I have like clear memories of being in a city trying to do some reading in an apartment on a Sunday afternoon, and there's like some kind of parade happening, which seems like really great civic activity, but like very intrusive on bandwidth. You might think, okay, that's fine. It's Sunday afternoon. That's a time for civic activity. But kind of balancing the civic engagement, noise-making activities with the kind of bandwidth preserving noise restrictions, so that people then, in the response, you might worry that people where there is too much noise have this inducement to kind of pullbacks from civic life as a way of like protecting themselves. So anyway, those are some very speculative thoughts about other conditions that might be interlocking with why we would need to provide people with time to engage in civic activity. All right, and thank you for organizing this excellent conference, and to Lisa for the book.
Okay, great. Thanks, Julie. So we did start a little bit late. So I think we still have maybe 7 minutes. Understand those who have needed to leave. So Lisa, maybe I'll just leave it up to you with how much you want to reply. Do you want to just reply for those 7 minutes? Perhaps people could.
I will try to be faster
Okay.
at the risk of losing some of Julie's excellent points, but then we can have space for 1 or 2 more questions. So should we try that?
Sure.
Okay. Excellent points. Let me maybe start with the second one. Yes, I think that you have many interesting points here, and I guess I'm totally with you on the TikTok issue. So maybe I should talk about the TikTok objection, not the Netflix objections. And I think there's really a strong case to be made for at least protecting young people, but maybe also banning or sort of, at least nudging people into something else. So I think we have an addiction issue here that needs public attention and intervention. About noise exposure and the kinds of things that you mentioned, I mean, I guess there's a general question also about health and stressors in life. Shift work, for example, is very bad for your health after a certain number of years. People leave too exhausted to do any civic engagement. So I think lots of other protective mechanisms have arguments for them in general, intrinsically, but also have an effect on how able people are to then still civically engage. And I guess when you were talking about it, one thought that came to my mind was like, you want there to be offers both for different types of people. And I was thinking introverts, extroverts, but that's just one kind of dimension. You want the quiet person who really likes to be in a quiet space to volunteer for the library, and you want the very extroverted, loud person who loves noise and so on to guide the parade, maybe. So I think, there needs to be a sufficient range of possibilities for different types of people. The part-time argument is also very interesting that you mentioned, but I wonder to what extent people who do not work at all do so voluntarily. And so in that sense, if you have a job guarantee, but also sufficient childcare, sufficient care for others that they might actually be taken care of and therefore not be able to work, that could already, get people into part-time work at least. So there I would want to look more into insofar as the empirics allow this, for really the deeper causes. Now, on the various questions about mandatoriness, so much to be said. I guess in general, I was imagining this all very much along the lines of a European Sunday. And that means many things closed, some essential services still available, but people really also having a different sense of time on the day, really, which makes also, helps with the mental space for doing something else. I think many European countries have some kind of maximum working norms per week per person. So that would also be something that could then be reduced. So that instead, I think at the moment it's 80 in many countries. So it could then be some, maybe, I don't know, 60. But of course, all of that only makes sense if people can earn enough money for a decent life in the hours they get. So the inequality issues and what Tom said about the welfare state and other measures, all of that also needs to be kept in mind there. Now, on mandatory stuff for the service side, I guess my general principle is, let's try the non-mandatory strategies first, and if they don't work out, we might have reasons to proceed with the mandatory ones. So I'm not in principle opposed to it. I think we haven't really tried the softer measures yet, and so it's not the right point to go immediately to the mandatory ones. But maybe in different countries, the temporal dynamics might be different, and maybe in some countries, civic work has gone down so much that you actually need to start with a mandatory format, and then maybe over time you could go to a more subtle, more social norm supported model. I need to think more about what you said about high-skilled professionals, because I see the pull of the argument of saying they should do more. But then again, I see civic work not only as a duty, but also as a benefit and something valuable. And I wouldn't want to be in a situation where only privileged people can actually access this. So in that sense, I think I'm more in favor ultimately of more universal strategies for that. And one last thing, you talked about parenting norms and child enrichment. I mean, I've started doing interviews for my next project on unpaid work and democracy. One very interesting thing in the Dutch context is that lots of parents volunteer a lot for clubs and schools and associations. And so in that sense, it's at least not only their own child, it's still neighborhood segregated and so on. But there's something very interesting about how one can think about the work that parents do as reaching more than just their own family. And I think that that's something I need to explore more and think more about. But maybe, you could go from these competitive parenting norms that are just about getting your own child ahead towards norms that are more about serving a diverse community of children together. I'll stop here, but thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much. So